Okay, so now let's talk about the basic proportions of a female character. So I'm still going to use the 8 heads tall. Again, this is going to vary greatly based upon the type of character you're trying to envision and draw. But 8 heads tall is a pretty good starting point. Mainly, it's easy math, so I can adjust it up or down as I'm progressing through it. But the thing I like to think about is the halfway point being 4 heads down. So let me show you how I do that. So I'm going to start with a basic head, and this part I don't do probably every time, but for the sake of you being able to understand it more easily, I'm going to do this. But again, you could probably do this more when you start out, and then as you progress, you get a little bit better at just gauging what's off the page. So there's the 8 heads tall model right there. And so now let's tone this back. And I still want the female character to be a little bit less tall than the male. Obviously not always the case, but generally so. Okay, so now as I draw into this, I've got my reference point. And so I draw the head out again. And I would immediately go down to the 4 heads down and mark the halfway point. Again, this isn't exact, but it's approximate. And then from here, what I would do is just get in, I'll actually work down and I'll throw in our 3 major masses. So I'll go for the torso. I'm just going to lightly sketch this in with the basic primitive or basic version of a torso, basic representation, center line to the body, a little bit off center there. And then for the pelvis, one of the major differences for the pelvis in relationship from the male to the female is more of a V-like shape. So a steeper angle, more dramatic angle. Or for the male, you see it's more boxy and more to the side. So you can do that even with the basic representation of the pelvis. Okay, for the legs, widen the stance a little bit. Outward bend, back bend. So for here, it's probably safe to say that the leg is roughly down 2 heads more, but I would say a little bit higher. And I'm going to purposely shorten the form a little bit. So I probably won't use the full 8 heads, probably go more like 7.5. So realistically with the legs, I'm gauging more by the look of the upper leg to the lower leg more than I'm looking at the heads at this point. Okay, and this is the part where I want you to realize that the heads tall unit of measurement is a starting point. It's not the end all, especially because, as I've probably already mentioned, that there's just so many different variations in people that you couldn't really stay too tight to this. In fact, there's lots of different units of measurement anyways, so you can read up on different variations from different artists. So the breasts, I would say, are roughly 2.5 down, but I am going visually off this. Usually what I generally try to do for the breasts is I will make sure that the distance that encompasses the main volume of the breast is at least equal to the area from that to the collarbone. Again, that's not a one size fits all either. It's just something that I generally look for. And so the rib cage really, I feel, sits a little bit lower at this point. So the big thing that I have to be careful of is the distance, and this is where I feel like I need to lower the pelvis, because the distance that I'm feeling already kind of forced. Actually, let me zoom up a bit more and show you specifically what I mean. I'm already feeling like the proportions are a bit more forced in this area, mainly because I started with the rib cage a little too high. So as I bring that down, so I bring the breast down, then I bring the rib cage down. So what does that do? It makes me want to lower the pelvis a little bit more. So I'm just going to drop that down a little bit. I like to do small increments. I want at this stage also start to get in the bell, the hourglass form a little bit more. So I'm going to do that just with this couple of curves. Now the hips are wider than the upper rib cage area, so I need to be aware of that. It's real easy to draw those too even, kind of hurt that effect a little bit, hurt that form. And so now what I want to do, I feel like this is about the right space. I'm kind of envisioning where the abdominal muscles would come down. They actually come down pretty low. They're just not as defined generally on the bottom as much, so we tend to ignore them a little bit more at the bottom. But so let's say something about there. Get the arms in. There's a relationship from the arms with the navel, the elbow with the navel. It's a little bit of a curve. I don't think the elbows are really specifically lined up to the navel, but they're close. Again, that little bit of a lightning bolt to get that representation of anatomy going back and forth. We'll attach the hands roughly to the lower section of the pelvis. I'm just kind of throwing in some placeholders for now because I want to make sure I don't render into any specific area too much as I'm still trying to figure things out. I do think it's helpful to keep the arms very thin at first. Again, this isn't the final render of it, but I think it's helpful to start very thin at first. And also to get used to bringing the deltoid sweeping down into one nice curve like this. Now, obviously there's women that have very defined deltoid muscles that are very rigid and strong, like, look a bit more like this. But that's a little more rare, right? So what's generally going to happen is you're going to see a lot more softer forms that kind of flow into the arm like this. A lot of times you'll see this part of the arm come way down, and there's almost no definition to the deltoid. So it's just something to keep in mind. There's different variations of that as well. So as we bring the leg down, we want to think about the leg being wider. We got to remember that here we have the the femur comes out like this, so it pushes against this area on the side there. So I need to bring that out. And then as we work down into the leg here, remember you could drop in your cylinders first, get kind of a comfort going with that volume, and then blend into the more organic version that I'm doing here. Whatever you feel most comfortable with is fine. And I feel like since I did lower the pelvis, I might end up using that 8-head stall. Still trying to figure that out. As I get down to the bottom here, the lower leg is not as tall as the femur area. Draw a line across there because it's easy for me to skew a foot. Remember, the inside of the legs are straighter by comparison. The outside looks like two curves in succession. And then from the breast, from the main mass of it, let me get rid of the headstall because it's getting a little confusing now. I will actually bring those up as kind of like teardrops and point those a little bit towards the middle, where we get that divide in between the clavicle, that jugular fossa. And so now we've got the basic forms in place for the female proportions. And so looking at this, it's, maybe the torso area could be a little bit less tall, but I really feel like this is pretty accurate for what I would go for. So I'll stop here. We'll take this a bit further and clean it up and talk about, general things that you might change, or how I would go about cleaning it up really. But the thing is that all of this is going to vary, based upon, is this a skinnier individual? Are they heavier set? Do they have bad posture? There's a lot of things that still go into this. So you want to start first with this basic heads tall way of thinking, unit of measurement. But then you're going to push these things around. You're going to get to a point where you're like, well, for my characters, I'm typically 2.5 heads down, and that's really where the nipple placement is, or whatever, 2.25. And so you kind of develop your own shorthand method for all of this. But by first paying attention to the initial start of the heads unit of measurement, it does give you something to hinge upon and something to build some confidence with, I guess. So let's stop here, head over to the next lesson, and continue on.